Hello. Ngày 22 tháng 7 2024. 22 tháng 7. Hôm nay là một tuần mới rồi. Sáng nay mình cũng đi tập bình thường. Tập được khá đều ấy. Tính đến hôm nay là đi tập được 4 buổi rồi. Tất cả mọi thứ là đúng theo như plan. Mình vẫn đang cố gắng đi tập để có thể coi được xem là cái 2 tháng nữa thì mình sẽ thay đổi như nào. Một cái là sáng nay trước khi đi tập ấy, không, chính xác hơn là trước khi đi làm, thì mình mới kiểu cảm thấy lo lắng khó chịu ấy, anxiety á. Mình lo lắng tới lúc mà chuẩn bị đi rồi, không đi đến nửa đường mình mới nghĩ một cách một cái logic ấy thì chả có gì mình phải lo lắng cả. Mọi thứ công việc rồi chuyện cá nhân thì nó cũng qua được một thời gian rồi, cả chuyện công việc luôn. Những cái thứ kiểu mình đã nghĩ là mình cần làm ấy, thì mình đã làm rồi và đã qua rồi. Bây giờ chỉ chờ thôi. Bây giờ là chờ xem là mình cần làm gì nữa để cho nó đạt được cái yêu cầu mình mong muốn. Cho nên là đấy, kỳ lạ như thế đấy. Kỳ lạ một cái là chả có gì thực sự đang đe dọa mình cả, nhưng mà mình cứ thấy kiểu cảm thấy khó chịu, cảm thấy không thoải mái, cảm thấy lo lắng. Thì mình mới tự hỏi là liệu có phải là do mình dạo này không chạy bộ không? Nhưng mà ngay lập tức khi mà mình có câu hỏi đấy thì mình nghĩ là cả kể là như thế đi chăng nữa ấy. Bởi vì theo cái logic của mình ấy, là cái việc chạy bộ ấy, giúp mình tiết ra những hormone nó tốt hơn, cảm thấy không bị stress nhiều. Nhưng mà đấy, sau khi mà ngay cái câu hỏi đấy bật ra trong đầu của mình thì mình có câu trả lời luôn. Nó là kể cả như thế đi chăng nữa thì mình đã có câu trả lời từ trước rồi mà. Nó chỉ là hormone thôi, nhưng thực tế nó không phải như vậy. Cho nên là hôm nay đến công ty làm thì cũng căng thẳng. Cũng căng thẳng. Nhưng mà thôi, mọi thứ thì cũng hòm. Nên là cứ chờ thôi. Chờ xem có gì đến thì mình ứng xử sau. Rồi, Ray Dalio. Mình biết Ray Dalio chắc năm ngoái. Mình cỡ năm ngoái, thông qua podcast của Lex Fridman. Thì Ray Dalio là ai? Là một nhà đầu tư có thể sánh vai được với Warren Buffett. Nhưng mà cái triết lý đầu tư của ông Ray Dalio thì giống kiểu như là sư tổ của trading ấy. Warren Buffett thì theo kiểu đầu tư giá trị hơn, còn Ray Dalio thì là một, gọi là gì, đứng đầu một quỹ hedge fund lớn nhất thế giới. Ray Dalio có 2 clip mà thực sự là mình xem ấy mà cũng là được nhận xét luôn. 2 clip này thực sự nó quá tuyệt vời ấy. Đó là 2 clip về giáo dục, kiến thức. Một là cái mình sẽ xem này, đó là cái clip nói về việc là cái cỗ máy kinh tế hoạt động như thế nào. Nó nghe rất đơn giản đúng không? Nhưng mà thực sự là cái cách giải thích cũng như cách trình bày top tier luôn. Kiểu mọi thứ nó đơn giản hóa một cách dễ hiểu nhất và nó chi tiết cặn kẽ. Còn cái clip thứ hai là cái clip mà nói về việc là sự thay đổi trật tự thế giới. Các quốc gia kiểu, gọi là gì, những quốc gia đứng đầu thế giới thì sẽ lập ra trật tự. Thì cái trật tự thế giới đấy nó thay đổi như thế nào và mình ứng xử như thế nào ở trong cái hoàn cảnh như thế. Thì hôm nay mình sẽ xem cái clip đầu tiên. Clip thứ hai thì mình không chắc mình có xem không, bởi vì thứ hai clip này mình xem rồi. Nhưng mà clip này mình xem, nếu mà mình nhớ không nhầm thì là mình xem năm ngoái. Clip này từ 10 năm trước rồi. 10 năm trước, nghĩa là 20 đây, để mình chuyển màn hình. 10 năm trước, tháng 9 năm 2023, 39 triệu view. Kiểu cái clip này một cái kiến thức về nó kiểu nhỉ rất là quý giá, siêu quý giá luôn. Một clip mà ước gì mọi clip ở trên YouTube ấy, nó cũng chất lượng được như này. Thì hôm nay mình muốn xem lại để mình thấm nhuần hơn, hiểu hơn những thứ mà mình chưa hiểu ở trong clip này. Ok, bắt đầu.
Works in 30 minutes. How the economic machine works in 30 minutes. The economy works like a simple machine, but many people don't understand it, or they don't agree on how it works, and this has led to a lot of needless economic suffering. I feel a deep sense of responsibility to share my simple but practical economic template. Though it's unconventional, it has helped me to anticipate and to sidestep the global financial crisis, and it has worked well for me for over 30 years. Let's begin. Though the economy might seem complex, it works in a simple mechanical way. It's made up of a few simple parts and a lot of simple transactions that are repeated over and over again a zillion times. These transactions are above all else driven by human nature, and they create three main forces that drive the economy. Number one, productivity growth. Number two, the short-term debt cycle. And number three, the long-term debt cycle. We'll look at these three forces and how laying them on top of each other creates a good template for tracking economic movements and figuring out what's happening now. Let's start with the simplest part of the economy, transactions. An economy is simply the sum of the transactions that make it up, and a transaction is a very simple thing. You make transactions all the time. Every time you buy something, you create a transaction. Each transaction consists of a buyer exchanging money or credit with a seller for goods, services, or financial assets. Credit spends just like money, so adding together the money spent and the amount of credit spent, you can know the total spending. The total amount of spending drives the economy. If you divide the amount spent by the quantity sold, you get the price. And that's it. That's a transaction. It's the building block of the economic machine. All cycles and all forces in an economy are driven by transactions. So, if we can understand transactions, we can understand the whole economy. A market consists of all the buyers and all the sellers making transactions for the same thing. For example, there is a wheat market, a car market, a stock market, and markets for millions of things. An economy consists of all of the transactions in all of its markets. If you add up the total spending and the total quantity sold in all of the markets, you have everything you need to know to understand the economy. It's just that simple. People, businesses, banks, and governments all engage in transactions the way I just described, exchanging money and credit for goods, services, and financial assets. The biggest buyer and seller is the government, which consists of two important parts: a central government that collects taxes and spends money, and a central bank, which is different from other buyers and sellers because it controls the amount of money and credit in the economy. It does this by influencing interest rates and printing new money. For these reasons, as we'll see, the central bank is an important player in the flow of credit. I want you to pay attention to credit. Credit is the most important part of the economy and probably the least understood. It's the most important part because it's the biggest and most volatile part. Just like buyers and sellers go to the market to make transactions, so do lenders and borrowers. Lenders usually want to make their money into more money, and borrowers usually want to buy something they can't afford, like a house or a car, or they want to invest in something like starting a business. Credit can help both lenders and borrowers get what they want. Borrowers promise to repay the amount they borrow, called principal, plus an additional amount called interest. When interest rates are high, there is less borrowing because it's expensive. When interest rates are low, borrowing increases because it's cheaper. When borrowers promise to repay and lenders believe them, credit is created. Any two people can agree to create credit out of thin air. That seems simple enough, but credit is tricky because it has different names. As soon as credit is created, it immediately turns into debt. Debt is both an asset to the lender and a liability to the borrower. In the future, when the borrower repays the loan plus interest, the asset and the liability disappear and the transaction is settled. So why is credit so important? Because when a borrower receives credit, he is able to increase his spending. And remember, spending drives the economy. This is because one person's spending is another person's income. Think about it. Every dollar you spend, someone else earns, and every dollar you earn, someone else has spent. So when you spend more, someone else earns more. When someone's income rises, it makes lenders more willing to lend him money because now he's more worthy of credit. A credit-worthy borrower has two things: the ability to repay and collateral. Having a lot of income in relation to his debt gives him the ability to repay. In the event that he can't repay, he has valuable assets to use as collateral that can be sold. This makes lenders feel comfortable lending him money. So increased income allows increased borrowing, which allows increased spending. And since one person's spending is another person's income, this leads to more increased borrowing, and so on. This self-reinforcing pattern leads to economic growth and is why we have cycles. In a transaction, you have to give something in order to get something, and how much you get depends on how much you produce. Over time, we learn, and that accumulated knowledge raises our living standards. We call this productivity growth. Those who are inventive and hardworking raise their productivity and their living standards faster than those who are complacent and lazy. But that isn't necessarily true over the short run. Productivity matters most in the long run, but credit matters most in the short run. This is because productivity growth doesn't fluctuate much, so it's not a big driver of economic swings. Debt is, because it allows us to consume more than we produce when we acquire it, and it forces us to consume less than we produce when we have to pay it back. Debt swings occur in two big cycles. One takes about 5 to 8 years, and the other takes about 75 to 100 years. While most people feel the swings, they typically don't see them as cycles because they see them too up close, day by day, week by week. In this chapter, we're going to step back
5 đến 8 năm. Thế mình đang đứng đâu? Khi mà 2021 thì tưởng nó 2020. Tự dưng tất cả thị trường tài chính nó sập xuống. Nhưng mà sập một thời gian và từ đó đến giờ thì có tăng trưởng một cách kinh khủng luôn. Thì có nghĩa là mà không 2022, cuối 2022 thì lại giảm từ đỉnh xuống còn cỡ khoảng 70-75%. Bây giờ lại lên khoảng 80%, 90, 80-85% so với đỉnh. Thì bây giờ mình đang ở đâu?
I can look at these three big forces and how they interact to make up our experiences. As mentioned, swings around the line are not due to how much innovation or hard work there is. They're primarily due to how much credit there is. Let's for a second imagine an economy without credit. In this economy, the only way I can increase my spending is to increase my income, which requires me to be more productive and do more work. Increased productivity is the only way for growth. Since my spending is another person's income, the economy grows every time I or anyone else is more productive. If we follow the transactions and play this out, we see a...
Chờ chút, mình quên chưa đổi cái này là ngày 22 đúng.
progression like the productivity growth line. But because we borrow, we have cycles. This isn't due to any laws or regulations, it's due to human nature and the way that credit works. Think of borrowing as simply a way of pulling spending forward. In order to buy something you can't afford, you need to spend more than you make. To do this, you essentially need to borrow from your future self. In doing so, you create a time in the future that you need to spend less than you make in order to pay it back. It very quickly resembles a cycle. Basically, anytime you borrow, you create a cycle. This is as true for an individual as it is for the economy. This is why understanding credit is so important, because it sets into motion a mechanical, predictable series of events that will happen in the future. This makes credit different from money. Money is what you settle transactions with. When you buy a beer from a bartender with cash, the transaction is settled immediately. But when you buy a beer with credit, it's like starting a bar tab. You're saying you promise to pay in the future. Together, you and the bartender create an asset and a liability. You just created credit out of thin air. It's not until you pay the bar tab later that the asset and the liability disappear, the debt goes away, and the transaction is settled. The reality is that most of what people call money is actually credit. The total amount of credit in the United States is about $50 trillion, and the total amount of money is only about $3 trillion. Remember, in an economy without credit, the only way to increase your spending is to produce more. But in an economy with credit, you can also increase your spending by borrowing. As a result, an economy with credit has more spending and allows incomes to rise faster than productivity over the short run, but not over the long run. Now, don't get me wrong. Credit isn't necessarily something bad that just causes cycles. It's bad when it finances overconsumption that can't be paid back. However, it's good when it efficiently allocates resources and produces income so you can pay back the debt. For example, if you borrow money to buy a big TV, it doesn't generate income for you to pay back the debt. But if you borrow money to, say, buy a tractor, and that tractor lets you harvest more crops and earn more money, then you can pay back your debt and improve your living standards. In an economy with credit, we can follow the transactions and see how credit creates growth. Let me give you an example. Suppose you earn $100,000 a year and have no debt. You are creditworthy enough to borrow $10,000, say on a credit card. So you can spend $110,000 even though you only earn $100,000. Since your spending is another person's income, someone is earning $110,000. The person earning $110,000 with no debt can borrow $11,000, so he can spend $121,000, even though he has only earned $110,000. His spending is another person's income, and by following the transactions, we can begin to see how this process works in a self-reinforcing pattern. But remember, borrowing creates cycles, and if the cycle goes up, it eventually needs to come down. This leads us into the short-term debt cycle. As economic activity increases, we see an expansion, the first phase of the short-term debt cycle. Spending continues to increase and prices start to rise. This happens because the increase in spending is fueled by credit, which can be created instantly out of thin air. When the amount of spending and incomes grow faster than the production of goods, prices rise. When prices rise, we call this inflation. The central bank doesn't want too much inflation because it causes problems. Seeing prices rise, it raises interest rates. With higher interest rates, fewer people can afford.
Ví như Mỹ chẳng hạn. Mỹ thì không phải đang mà là trong vòng khoảng 23 hơn một năm qua thì Mỹ đã tăng cái interest rate là gì? Lãi suất trong vòng hơn một năm qua, một năm rưỡi qua. Tuy nhiên vấn đề là thị trường chứng khoán Mỹ lại đang rất là cao. Trong khi đó thì ở thời điểm hiện tại, thời điểm này là cuối tháng 7 2024. Thị trường chứng khoán rất là cao, và sau 1 năm rưỡi nâng lãi, thì interest rate là gì? Điểm tỷ lệ. Interest là lãi suất. Lãi suất. Sau 1 năm rưỡi tăng lãi suất rồi, thì cái thời điểm hiện tại này tất cả mọi người đang kỳ vọng là sẽ giảm lãi suất. Mà giảm lãi suất thì có nghĩa là sẽ có nhiều tiền hơn đi ra ngoài. Và có nhiều tiền hơn đi ra ngoài thì thị trường chứng khoán sẽ tăng. Thế là sao? Tất nhiên mình hiểu là thị trường chứng khoán chỉ là một thứ mà biểu diễn thôi, để biểu diễn thôi, chứ không phải là mình làm mọi thứ để thị trường chứng khoán nó tăng một cách healthy. Nhưng mà đứng ở khía cạnh là một người mà tham gia thị trường chứng khoán ở Việt Nam, chứ không tham gia ở Mỹ. Mặc dù Việt Nam thì cũng ảnh hưởng một phần thôi, nhưng mà trong trường hợp mà Việt Nam bây giờ chưa lên đỉnh lại năm 2021 nhé, và Mỹ thì đang ở trên đỉnh rồi, cao hơn 2021 rồi, thì khi mà Mỹ sập xuống thì Việt Nam chắc chắn sẽ bị ảnh hưởng. Thế mình phải làm gì bây giờ?
Afford to borrow money, and the cost of existing debts rises. Think about this as the monthly payments on your credit card going up. Because people borrow less and have higher debt repayments, they have less money left over to spend. So spending slows. And since one person's spending is another person's income, incomes drop. And so on and so forth. When people spend less, incomes drop. And since one person's spending is another person's income, incomes drop. And so on and so forth. When people spend less, prices go down. We call this deflation. Economic activity decreases, and we have a recession. If the recession becomes too severe and inflation is no longer a problem, the central bank will lower interest rates to cause everything to pick up again. With low interest rates, debt repayments are reduced and borrowing and spending pick up, and we see another expansion. As you can see, the economy works like a machine. In the short-term debt cycle, spending is constrained.
Thế có nghĩa là thực sự là mặc dù mình ở cái trạng thái là không bị ảnh hưởng quá nhiều, nhưng mà mình cũng theo dõi và mình cũng quan sát thấy là thực sự là mọi người đang bị ảnh hưởng rất là lớn luôn. Đặc biệt là nửa đầu năm 2024 này, khi mà lượng tiêu dùng rồi cái lượng mua sắm ấy của mọi người nói chung ở Việt Nam thì đang giảm rất là nhiều so với năm ngoái. Thì đó, nếu mà trong trường hợp mà lãi suất, nhưng mà tại sao lãi suất Việt Nam lại đang rất là thấp? Có nghĩa là Việt Nam đã kích cầu gần 1 năm nay rồi. Mỹ thì vẫn đang chưa kích, Mỹ vẫn đang để lãi suất rất là cao. Việt Nam kích cầu hơn 1 năm nay rồi mà vẫn chưa hiệu quả gì. Bởi vì là thị trường nước ngoài, cụ thể đây là thị trường Mỹ, họ chưa mua sắm nhiều à? Tất cả mọi người đều khó khăn. Tất cả mọi người đều khó khăn, và tương lai là mọi người sẽ thoải mái hơn. Và khi thoải mái hơn thì tiền sẽ nhiều hơn và chứng khoán sẽ lên. Trong khi đó thì hôm nay vừa nãy mình vừa đọc với cả ở trên báo thì cái chỉ số, để xem nào. Đây, cái trang đầu tiên mà mình mở qua Google News. Chỉ báo Warren Buffett đạt kỷ lục 200%, tín hiệu cảnh báo nhà đầu tư trên thị trường chứng khoán. Thế thị trường chứng khoán sắp sập à? Không sập thì cũng phải downtrend rất là mạnh.
Only by the willingness of lenders and borrowers to provide and receive credit. When credit is easily available, there's an economic expansion. When credit isn't easily available, there's a recession. And note that this cycle is controlled and easily available.
Suy thoái.
There's a recession. And note that this cycle is controlled primarily by the central bank. The short-term debt cycle typically lasts 5 to 8 years and happens all. The short-term debt cycle typically lasts 5.
Vậy là một chu kỳ tăng và một chu kỳ giảm là 5 đến 8 năm. 5 đến 8 năm.
to 8 years and happens over and over again for decades. But notice that the bottom and top of each cycle finish with more growth than the previous cycle and with more debt. Why? Because people push it. They have an inclination to borrow and spend more instead of paying back debt. It's human nature. Because of this, over long periods of time, debts rise faster than incomes, creating the long-term debt cycle. Despite people becoming more indebted, lenders even more freely extend credit. Why? Because everyone thinks things are going great. People are just focused on what's been happening lately. And what's been happening lately? Incomes have been rising. Asset values are going up. The stock market roars. It's a boom. It pays to buy goods, services, and financial assets with borrowed money. When people do a lot of that, we call it a bubble. So even though debts have been growing, incomes have been growing nearly as fast to offset them. Let's call the ratio of debt to income the debt burden. So long as incomes continue to rise, the debt burden stays manageable. At the same time, asset values soar. People borrow huge amounts of money to buy assets as investments, causing their prices to rise even higher. People feel wealthy. So even with the accumulation of lots of debt, rising incomes and asset values help borrowers remain creditworthy for a long time. But this obviously cannot continue forever. And it doesn't. Over decades, debt burdens slowly increase, creating larger and larger debt repayments. At some point, debt repayments start growing faster than incomes, forcing people to cut back on their spending. And since one person's spending is another person's income, incomes begin to go down, which makes people less creditworthy, causing borrowing to go down. Debt repayments continue to rise, which makes spending drop even further. And the cycle reverses itself. This is the long-term debt peak. Debt burdens have simply become too big. For the United States, Europe, and much of the rest of the world, this happened in 2008. It happened for the same reason it happened in Japan in 1989 and in the United States back in 1929. Now the economy begins deleveraging. In a deleveraging, people cut spending, incomes fall, credit disappears, asset prices drop, banks get squeezed, the stock market crashes, social tensions rise, and the whole thing starts to feed on itself the other way. As incomes fall and debt repayments rise, borrowers get squeezed. No longer creditworthy, credit dries up, and borrowers can no longer borrow enough money to make their debt repayments. Scrambling to fill this hole, borrowers are forced to sell assets. The rush to sell assets floods the market at the same time as spending falls. This is when the stock market collapses, the real estate market tanks, and banks get into trouble. As asset prices drop, the value of the collateral borrowers can put up drops. This makes borrowers even less creditworthy. People feel poor. Credit rapidly disappears. Less spending, less income, less wealth, less credit, less borrowing, and so on. It's a vicious cycle. This appears similar to a recession, but the difference here is that interest rates can't be lowered to save the day. In a recession, lowering interest rates works to stimulate borrowing. However, in a deleveraging, lowering interest rates doesn't work because interest rates are already low and soon hit 0%, so the stimulation ends. Interest rates in the United States hit 0% during the deleveraging of the 1930s and again in 2008. The difference between a recession and a deleveraging is that in a deleveraging, borrowers' debt burdens have simply gotten too big and can't be relieved by lowering interest rates. Lenders realize that debts have become too large to ever be fully paid back. Borrowers have lost their ability to repay and their collateral has lost value. They feel crippled by the debt. They don't even want more. Lenders stop lending, borrowers stop borrowing. Think of the economy as being not creditworthy, just like an individual. So what do you do about a deleveraging? The problem is debt burdens are too high and they must come down. There are 4 ways this can happen. 1, people, businesses, and governments cut their spending. 2, debts are reduced through defaults and restructurings. 3, wealth is redistributed from the haves to the have-nots. And finally, 4, the central bank prints new money. These 4 ways have happened in every deleveraging in modern history. Usually, spending is cut first. As we just saw, people, businesses, and even governments tighten their belts and cut their spending so that they can pay down their debt.
Hiện tại đang cut spending.
This is often referred to as austerity. When borrowers stop taking on new debts and start paying down old debts, you might expect the debt burden to decrease. But the opposite happens. Because spending is cut, and one man's spending is another man's income, it causes incomes to fall. They fall faster than debts are repaid, and the debt burden actually gets worse. As we've seen, this cut in spending is deflationary and painful. Businesses are forced to cut costs, which means less jobs and higher unemployment. This leads to the next step. Debts must be reduced. Many borrowers find themselves unable to repay their loans, and a borrower's debts are a lender's assets. When a borrower doesn't repay the bank, people get nervous that the bank won't be able to repay them, so they rush to withdraw their money from the bank. Banks get squeezed, and people, businesses, and banks default on their debts. This severe economic contraction is a depression. A big part of a depression is people discovering much of what they thought was their wealth isn't really there. Let's go back to the bar. When you bought a beer and put it on a bar tab, you promised to repay the bartender. Your promise became an asset of the bartender. But if you break your promise, if you don't pay him back and essentially default on your bar tab, then the asset he has isn't really worth anything. It has basically disappeared. Many lenders don't want their assets to disappear and agree to debt restructuring. Debt restructuring means lenders get paid back less, or get paid back over a longer time frame, or at a lower interest rate than was first agreed. Somehow, a contract is broken in a way that reduces debt. Lenders would rather have a little of something than all of nothing. Even though debt disappears, debt restructuring causes income and asset values to disappear faster, so the debt burden continues to get worse. Like cutting spending, debt reduction is also painful and deflationary. All of this impacts the central government because lower incomes and less employment means the government collects fewer taxes. At the same time, it needs to increase its spending because unemployment has risen. Many of the unemployed have inadequate savings and need financial support from the government. Additionally, governments create stimulus plans and increase their spending to make up for the decrease in the economy. Governments' budget deficits explode in a deleveraging because they spend more than they earn in taxes. This is what's happening when you hear about the budget deficit on the news. To fund their deficits, governments need to either raise taxes or borrow money. But with incomes falling and so many unemployed, who is the money going to come from? The rich. Since governments need more money and since wealth is heavily concentrated in the hands of a small percentage of the people,
Trong khi đó thì Trump thì là đảng Cộng Hòa, và đảng Cộng Hòa thì favor những người giàu. Thì trong 4 năm nữa là những người giàu vẫn sẽ giàu thêm. Thì chứng khoán sẽ lên à?
Governments naturally raise taxes on the wealthy, which facilitates a redistribution of wealth in the economy from the haves to the have-nots. The have-nots who are suffering begin to resent the wealthy haves. The wealthy haves, being squeezed by the weak economy, falling asset prices, and higher taxes, begin to resent the have-nots. If the depression continues, social disorder can break out. Not only do tensions rise within countries, they can rise between countries, especially debtor and creditor countries. This situation can lead to political change that can sometimes be extreme. In the 1930s, this led to Hitler coming to power, war in Europe, and depression in the United States. Pressure to do something to end the depression increases. Remember, most of what people thought was money was actually credit. So when credit disappears, people don't have enough money. People are desperate for money, and you remember who can print money? The central bank can. Having already lowered its interest rates to nearly zero, it's forced to print money. Unlike cutting spending, debt reduction, and wealth redistribution, printing money is inflationary and stimulative. Inevitably, the central bank prints new money out of thin air and uses it to buy financial assets and government bonds. It happened in the United States during the Great Depression, and again in 2008 when the United States Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, printed over $2 trillion. Other central banks around the world that could printed a lot of money too. By buying financial assets with this money, it helps drive up asset prices, which makes people more creditworthy. However, this only helps those who own financial assets.
Tức là khi nào mà in tiền nhiều thì chứng khoán sẽ lên, và sau đấy một thời gian nó lên đỉnh rồi nó sẽ sập. Tóm gọn là như vậy.
See, the central bank can print money, but it can only buy financial assets. The central government, on the other hand, can buy goods and services and put money in the hands of the people, but it can't print money. So in order to stimulate the economy, the two must cooperate. By buying government bonds, the central bank essentially lends money to the government, allowing it to run a deficit and increase spending on goods and services through its stimulus programs and unemployment benefits. This increases people's income as well as the government's debt. However, it will lower the economy's total debt burden. This is a very risky time. Policymakers need to balance the four ways that debt burdens come down. The deflationary ways need to balance with the inflationary ways in order to maintain stability. If balanced correctly, there can be a beautiful deleveraging. You see, a deleveraging can be ugly or it can be beautiful. How can a deleveraging be beautiful? Even though a deleveraging is a difficult situation, handling a difficult situation in the best possible way is beautiful. A lot more beautiful than the debt-fueled, unbalanced excesses of the leveraging phase. In a beautiful deleveraging, debts decline relative to income, real economic growth is positive, and inflation isn't a problem. It is achieved by having the right balance. The right balance requires a certain mix of cutting spending, reducing debt, transferring wealth, and printing money so that economic and social stability can be maintained. People ask if printing money will raise inflation. It won't if it offsets falling credit. Remember, spending is what matters. A dollar of spending paid for with money has the same effect on price as a dollar of spending paid for with credit. By printing money, the central bank can make up for the disappearance of credit with an increase in the amount of money. In order to turn things around, the central bank needs to not only pump up income growth, but get the rate of income growth higher than the rate of interest on the accumulated debt. So what do I mean by that? Basically, income needs to grow faster than debt grows. For example, let's assume that a country going through a deleveraging has a debt-to-income ratio of 100%. That means that the amount of debt it has is the same as the amount of income the entire country makes in a year. Now think about the interest rate on that debt. Let's say it's 2%. If debt is growing at 2% because of that interest rate, and income is only growing at around 1%, you will never reduce the debt burden. You need to print enough money to get the rate of income growth above the rate of interest. However, printing money could easily be abused because it's so easy to do and people prefer it to the alternatives. The key is to avoid printing too much money and causing unacceptably high inflation the way Germany did during its deleveraging in the 1920s. If policymakers achieve the right balance, a deleveraging isn't so dramatic. Growth is slow, but debt burdens go down. That's a beautiful deleveraging. When incomes begin to rise, borrowers begin to appear more creditworthy. And when borrowers appear more creditworthy, lenders begin to lend money again. Debt burdens finally begin to fall. Able to borrow money, people can spend more. Eventually, the economy begins to grow again, leading to the reflation phase of the long-term debt cycle. Though the deleveraging process can be horrible if handled badly, if handled well, it will eventually fix the problem. It takes roughly a decade or more for debt burdens to fall and economic activity to get back to
7 đến 10 năm. Từ 2008 đến năm 2018 đến năm 21, 22, 14 năm. Regression thì 2 năm, từ 22 đến 24. Lý thuyết là 25 lại bùng nổ đúng không?
normal. Hence the term
Bùng nổ nhiều thế, 23 đã bùng nổ rồi. 23 đã bùng nổ rồi. Xong rồi 24 cũng bùng nổ rồi, 25 cũng bùng nổ à?
lost decade. In closing, of course, the economy is a little bit more complicated than this template suggests. However, laying the short-term debt cycle on top of the long-term debt cycle, and then laying both of them on top of the productivity growth line, gives a reasonably good template for seeing where we've been, where we are now, and where we're probably headed. So, in summary, there are 3 rules of thumb that I'd like you to take away from this.
3 rules of thumb.
First, don't have debt rise faster than income, because your debt burdens will eventually crush you. Second, don't have income rise faster than productivity, because you'll eventually become uncompetitive. Faster than eventually
Một là không để nợ tăng nhanh hơn thu nhập.
crush you.
Hai
Second,
là đừng để
don't have income
thu nhập tăng nhanh hơn productivity. Đừng để thu nhập tăng hơn
rise faster than productivity, because you'll eventually become uncompetitive. And third, do all that you can to raise your productivity, because in the long run, that's what matters most. This is simple advice for you, and it's simple advice for policymakers. You might be surprised, but most people, including most policymakers, don't pay enough attention to this. This template has worked for me, and I hope it will work for you. Thank you.
Một là đừng để nợ tăng nhanh hơn thu nhập. 2, đừng để thu nhập tăng nhanh hơn productivity là gì? Sự hiệu quả. Productivity
gives a reasonably
Và thứ 3 là làm mọi thứ để tăng năng suất. Lần thứ 2 mình xem mình thấy clear hơn một chút, nhưng mà chắc chắn là mình nghĩ là mình cần lần thứ 3 nữa. Lần thứ 3. Thứ 2 nữa là mình cần chỉnh cái mic này. Nó gain bây giờ đang là 10, mình chỉnh lên 12 đi. 12 tròn luôn. Bởi vì là mình thấy là mình vẫn nói hơi nhỏ. Rồi, đây là clip thứ nhất. Bây giờ là được 46 phút. Clip thứ hai là mình nên xem cái nào ta. Mình có 2 cái, một là cái đây. Bây giờ dạo này mình rất là hai này giống nhau à? Từ chờ chút. Cái đâu nhỉ? Cái này không phải này. Đây. Dạo này gần đây mình rất là hạn chế xem những cái kiểu tiêu cực. Mặc dù là trước giờ mình không ngại cái đấy cả. Bởi vì lý do là mình bắt đầu bị ảnh hưởng khi mình xem những gì tiêu cực, nên là mình không thể bỏ nó ngoài đầu được, mình bị suy nghĩ đến nó. Nên là hai clip này là hai clip mà nói những cái điểm yếu, nói những điều không phải tiêu cực nhưng mà chỉ ra những điểm yếu ấy. Và mình hơi sợ là mình sẽ bị ảnh hưởng, bởi vì tâm lý hiện tại của mình nó không ổn định cho lắm. Tuy nhiên thì sẽ xem cái này ra. Bây giờ mình vừa nãy mình đang nghĩ là mình sẽ dựa vào cái thời lượng này để mình xem này cho nó vừa này, nhưng mà không, mình nghĩ là mình sẽ xem cái nào hợp lý hơn. Cái này là stop caring, result come. Stop trying, it happen. Của hai của một kênh à? Cái nào mới hơn? Cái này 8 tháng. Cái này chắc lâu rồi, cái này 1 năm. Cũng xem nhau à? Ok, xem này đi, xem này mình cảm giác hơi tích cực. Thôi xem này đi.
Once there was a writer who happened to specialize in crafting thought-provoking essays on various subjects. Through hard work and seemingly endless creativity, she managed to publish numerous pieces that captivated her readers. However, one day, she found herself in a creative slump, unable to find any inspiration for her next writing endeavor. She contemplated different topics, but none seemed to resonate. She scoured her bookshelves and searched the internet, but to no avail. A sense of panic crept in, as she feared she had exhausted her ideas or fallen victim to writer's block. Yet, after taking a deep breath, she made the conscious choice to let it go for a while and divert her attention to other pursuits. Strangely enough, while strolling through a serene forest, without any intention of conjuring up a subject or even thinking about her writing aspirations, an idea unexpectedly came to mind. And thus, she
Stop caring, result come.
Came to realize that when she ceased trying so hard, what she was looking for arose effortlessly. The writer experienced a curious paradox. She wanted to be productive, but the more she tried, the less she...
Sau này hơi bị theo kiểu là suy nghĩ nhanh và suy nghĩ chậm ấy, cũng như là cái gọi là từ gì nhỉ, mình không nhớ chính xác từ, nhưng mà kiểu như là suy nghĩ thụ động và suy nghĩ chủ động ấy. Kiểu chủ động ấy là mình thực sự mình ngồi mình nghĩ về nó, còn bị động passive ấy là theo kiểu mình đi làm cái gì đấy rồi từ đầu óc của mình lúc ấy nó vẫn hoạt động, chỉ là nó hoạt động ở một cái chế độ khác thôi mà mình không trực tiếp làm với nó thì tự dưng nó nhảy ra.
Good. Only when she ceased caring and lifted the enormous pressure of needing to be productive off of our shoulders was she able to write again. So striving and effort do not always get what we want. Moreover, these things can work against us. What's going on here? Author Aldous Huxley first described the law of reverse effect, saying that, and I quote, "The harder we try with a conscious will to do something, the less
conscious
we
or
shall
unconscious.
succeed." End quote. So, could it really be that when we stop consciously trying to succeed, we increase our chances of success? Will results come once we stop caring? This video explores the law of reverse effect, also known as the law of reverse effort. Long ago in ancient China, a merchant met a sage he heard was one of the wisest people alive. The merchant tried to impress the sage by telling him how much money he had made in his latest trade deal. The sage nodded, but didn't seem too impressed. Then he invited the sage to visit him to see his enormous house and all the riches he had accumulated over the years. But the sage still wasn't impressed. Instead, he asked the merchant why he wants to impress him so much by showing off his stuff. As the merchant didn't understand the question, the sage reminded him of the words of Lao Tzu, saying, "Those who try to outshine others dim their own light. Those who call themselves righteous can't know how wrong they are. Those who boast of their accomplishments diminish the things they have done. End quote. We self-righteous.
Những người tự cho mình không thể biết mình sai đến mức
Can't
nào.
know how wrong they are. Those who boast of their
Những người khoe khoang về thành tích của mình sẽ coi thường những việc họ đã làm.
accomplishments diminish the things they have done. End quote. We've been taught accomplishment requires effort, but with many things in life, effort can also be counterproductive. As for the merchant, he wanted to obtain the sage's approval, but the more he tried, the less he could impress him. The sage reminded us that the more we force our accomplishments upon others, the less we shine. If we accomplished so much, why must we continually remind others? People grow suspicious of individuals who need to boast, brag, and take the spotlight as much as possible. What are they trying to prove? Are they compensating for something? It seems that they need to convince the world of their value. Paradoxically, the more we feel we need to convince the world how valuable we are, the less value we believe the world thinks we have, which probably shows. If the merchant hadn't been so eager to impress, he could have let his accomplishments speak for themselves when the moment of their revelation arose, which would also have impressed the sage more, not just because of the achievements themselves, but also because he doesn't need to brag about them, says something about the merchant's character, that he is humble and secure within himself, and also detached to a certain extent from external objects like wealth and status. So the law of reverse effect struck again. He sabotaged his desired results by caring too much about the sage's opinion. Regarding our psychological well-being, the law of reverse effect also seemed to be at work, as we experience that by trying to control our mental states, we mostly just stand in our own way. In his blog, The Runaway Mind, Professor David Clark shares how too much effort causes difficulties in overcoming emotional distress. He asks the reader if we ever quote-unquote choked under pressure, for example, during a contest, exam, or job interview. He stated, "You may have spent a long time preparing for this moment. You reminded yourself over and over that you had to do your best. You could feel the intense pressure. All your attention and energy was channeled into your performance. With great effort and determination, you stepped forward. But then disaster struck. You blew it. You messed up and experienced one of the most shameful moments in your life." End quote. According to Clark, this so-called mental control paradox also applies to overcoming emotional distress. Trying too hard to stop negative thinking, for example, often backfires, only increasing our negativity. When we fall prey to the mental control paradox, we experience that the more we try to control our thinking, the less successful we are in doing so, which coincides with the law of reverse effect. Clark points to scientific research showing that humans aren't good at thought suppression as opposed to thought creation. We've explored the experiment of the pink elephant a couple of times on this channel, showing how difficult it is not to think consciously about a pink elephant. So when it comes to mental control, we could say, what you resist persists. Only when we stop trying, when we stop caring about the presence of the thought of a pink elephant in our minds, it eventually disappears. But the law of reverse effect also seems to work the other way around, referring to the story at the beginning of this video. The flow of creativity and mental control often don't mix. Although people are good at generating thoughts, forcing ourselves to evoke a creative solution, idea, or inspiration to progress our creative endeavors further often doesn't work. And the more we try, the less successful we are. The versatile artist and teacher Julia Cameron wrote in her book The Artist's Way, "All too often we try to push, pull, outline, and control our ideas instead of letting them grow organically. The creative process is a process of surrender, not control. Mystery is at the heart of creativity. That and surprise." End quote. We often experience our creativity blooming when we're not asking for it. For example, during a relaxing moment in the shower, during a forest walk, or just before bed. During those moments, when we have ceased caring about it, the idea we were looking for comes forward spontaneously.
Tự phát, spontaneously.
The ancient Taoists observed that when we're too occupied with the outcome, we're likely to sabotage our performance. The story in the Taoist scripture Zhuangzi about a nervous archer who shot perfectly during practice but couldn't perform during a tournament when competing for a prize shows how caring too much about the results works against us. When we care too much about the outcome, whatever we're doing, we feel tense. Even though we're usually perfectly able to perform the task, a sense of emergency is involved. Our minds are occupied with the future and may even dwell in the past, contemplating, for example, past mistakes. We're not present. We might believe that the more we worry about the task and its consequence, the more control we gain and the more chance we have to succeed. But the opposite is true. The more we worry, the more we try to control, the more likely our performances will suffer. Here's where the law of reverse effect comes to fruition again. The more we care about achieving success, the more it eludes us. When we care too much about the outcome, we will likely push ourselves in ways that eventually obstruct our progress. The ancient Taoists knew how people could stand in their own way when striving to achieve something. Instead of striving, they proposed Wu Wei, or effortless action. Athlete Christopher Berglund explains in an article on Psychology Today how the state of optimal performance, also known as the zone, paradoxically emerges when we don't strive for it. I quote, "It may seem counterintuitive, but a non-striving mindset, also known as Wu Wei, increases an athlete's chances of getting in the zone, performing effortlessly and winning. The paradox of Wu Wei is that striving less, not trying harder to win at all costs, often generates more success." End quote. When examining the mental state of effortless action, or being in the zone, we discover that this state of being, or state of doing for that matter, is characterized by a lack of discursive thoughts about the past and the future. Even though Wu Wei most likely leads to something we call results, these results are not the focus. The desired results may be in the back of our minds, but our attention is immersed in the task at hand. The task even ceases to be the task, as if the pianist becomes the musical piece, the writer becomes the novel, and the soccer player becomes the game. When there's no worry about one's future achievements or rumination about one's failures in the past, then one's performance won't be disturbed by these thoughts, which, so it seems, enhances it. Hence, we could say that once we stop caring, results come, as in the mental and physical obstacles we lay in place for ourselves as a consequence of caring about the outcome disappear. They don't obstruct pure and responsive action in the present, meaning action that effortlessly interplays with present circumstances. For example, we must be responsive to our environment to drive a car. Everything that happens in the environment is unprecedented and uniquely belongs to that specific moment. There are patterns and generalizations, of course, but when we look at the details, then what's happening on a particular highway, the cars present, the people in those cars, what these people do and think, and how they react is a unique, unprecedented symphony that we cannot cognitively predict. We can only rely on our driving skills and ability to respond well to everything that happens. But instead, our minds tend to try to control the future by creating detailed predictions and then constantly repeating these fantasies and our responses to them. But when the moment we have prepared ourselves for arrives, we find out that our detailed blueprints have become pretty useless. Moreover, all these thoughts and mental preparations prevent us from responding to what's actually happening. If we let go of this firewall of thoughts, we create space to let the environment come in, so we can respond to what happens instead of what we think would happen. Philosopher Dr. Wei-Lin Chong emphasizes the importance of openness regarding Wu Wei, saying, "No matter if it's about politics, governance, diplomacy, or any other activity, what Zhuangzi calls Wu Wei is this ultimate receptive and responsive way of action, from a crystal clear openness in yourself, one with the breathing of the cosmos." End quote.
cosmos, vũ trụ.
Whether we look at the mental control paradox or the Taoist idea of Wu Wei, these concepts show how our thoughts can stand in our way. The more we care about something, the more we tend to worry and ruminate about it, and the more these thoughts obstruct.
Đúng là cái mình đang trải qua là suy nghĩ về nó càng nhiều thì nó khiến cho mình căng thẳng và sợ.
The more we tend to worry and ruminate about it, and the more these thoughts obstruct the ability to act in ways that eventually lead to success, which corresponds with the law to act in ways that eventually lead to success, which corresponds with the law of reverse effect. By letting go of worrying about the outcome, it's more likely that we get the outcome we desire. Results don't come by repeatedly thinking about them or desiring them fiercely. They come through actions. And the more we let ourselves be carried away by the desired results, the less we tend to act in ways that contribute to achieving them. Caring too much about the results makes the archer in Zhuangzi's story tremble, a soccer player miss a penalty, and a writer unable to write. Thank you for watching.
Nó hơi bị self-help ấy, nhưng mà đúng rồi, những cái này nó là một cái principle, một cái ý tưởng về cái việc là mình phải đối mặt với cả những cái đấy nó như thế nào. Có những nguyên tắc, nó là nguyên tắc cách ứng xử để khi mà gặp những thứ như thế thì mình cư xử như thế nào. Thì mình hiểu là mọi thứ, thời gian này, mọi thứ khó khăn, bất cứ cỡ như thế nào đi chăng nữa ấy, thì thời gian nó sẽ giải quyết được. Thì là mình thấy mình bị khó chịu khá nhiều và nó ảnh hưởng đến cái suy nghĩ của mình, không làm được cái gì cả. Đặc biệt là khi mấy hôm trước mình đã kiểu đầu óc đã thông thoáng rồi, thì bắt đầu hôm qua khi mà đi với bạn bè thì mình lại nói lại cái chuyện đó và nói kiểu sâu hơn ấy. Bình thường thì thường nói, khi mà mình nói ra ấy, thì mọi thứ nó sẽ nhẹ nhàng hơn, nhưng mà khi mà hôm qua mình nói ra và sáng nay mình đi tập thì nó bắt đầu cản trở mình, cái suy nghĩ đấy nó cản trở mình và nó khiến mình không tập trung được như 3 cái buổi tập trước. Mà không sao, mọi thứ đều là learn. Mình không có khó khăn ấy thì không thể phát triển hơn được, không? Learn more. Gì? Learn more. Gần đây mình học một câu này trong quyển sách mình có đọc. Mình nhớ là cái thứ hai là study more. Câu đầu tiên nó là see much, study much, suffer much. That is a path to wisdom. Bye bye. Hẹn gặp lại vào thứ tư.